This is Donald Trump drawing a line in the sand, the end of the post-Cold War liberal international order. And it's almost as if the document is designed to create Trump's new order for America and for the world.
I think if I'm seeing this from Beijing, the feeling is that perhaps we're now reached the bottom of the worst period of US-China relations.
So the questions that many in the region are asking is there a different approach? Should regional countries be the ones managing conflicts all the way from Iran to Israel, Palestine, to the Red Sea, to Sudan? This is the region we're talking about. It's the hottest region, but it's also the fault line of this changing global order.
Hello again, and welcome to a special edition of Independent Thinking from the Doha Forum in Qatar. I'm Bronwen Maddox. This is a special edition, not just because it's in Qatar, not just because it's early in the week, but we're dedicating it to one particular subject that broke in the middle of this extraordinary conference, and that was the US's national security strategy. This is, anyway, an unpredictable conference. It's a lavishly equipped annual gathering for policymakers, diplomats, heads of state, business, humanitarian agencies, and it is one of the ways that Qatar has expressed its ambition to have influence and mediation, even as it said, way beyond the Middle East. Last year was dramatic because the Syrian president, Bashar Assad, fell on the Sunday, leaving the Iranians running for their planes, the Russians too. And this year, a different tone, partly because of President Trump's national security strategy, which lays out his administration's worldview, including a pivot from the Middle East, a lot of pretty rude words about Europeans, forcing them to pay more for the defense of Ukraine and their own countries, and some very interesting words about the rising economic and military force of China. So I've got with me two colleagues and one former colleague to discuss these stated intentions. Leslie Vinjamori, who is now president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and used to run our Americas program. Yujia, senior research fellow on China from our Asia-Pacific program, and Renard Mansour, a senior research fellow with our Middle East and North Africa program. Welcome to you all. Let's start with what this says. Leslie, did this seem very new to you?
It sort of felt new, but in fact, I think once we got into the details, it didn't feel so new. One thinks of the national security strategy as being a document for a specific administration, but really this is much more. This is Donald Trump drawing a line in the sand, the end of the post-Cold War liberal international order. And it's almost as if the document is designed to create Trump's new order for America and for the world. I think what's shocked many people was sort of seeing it in the fine print. But in fact, many of the broad contours of this national security strategy are what we've heard before, focusing on the Western Hemisphere, U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. We heard that in the inauguration speech, focusing on the Indo-Pacific and on China in particular. That's not new. Being very down on Europe, that's hardly new. You were at the Munich Security Conference, Bronwen. You heard it live. I think
so let's pick up that point, though, because this felt a remarkably continuous voice to me. I mean, there's some contradictions in it, but if you take the British equivalent, it reads as if it was written by committee, which it absolutely was. And what comes out is very hedged in many, many ways. This felt like someone, for example, J.D. Vance, the vice president who gave that Munich speech, sitting up in a garret and writing it through in one go.
In certain respects, yes. The conversation on Europe, the idea that Europe was, facing potentially civilizational erasure. But if you go to the front, I mean, the first thing is, this is clearly Donald Trump's decision to create a historical document, not only for Europe, for the rest of the world, for the United States today, but for generations to come. But in many ways, the part that was J.D. Vance was really what we heard at Munich. And it was the threat to Europe from not having freedom of speech, the cheerleading for patriotic parties across Europe. And there's almost a sort of a paternalism towards Europe, suggesting that if it doesn't do these things to focus on its growth, to spend more, to create more pluralism in its own democracies, that it would face decline. The question, I guess, that I had is, why throw the baby out with the bathwater? Why go to such extreme to reject the tools that the US has used over so many decades frequently to its benefit.
Well, that's a much bigger question, and we can go into that. India being one example where it's alienated that country. There are still some things that did feel new to me, talking about European countries needing resistance from within, calling on nationalistic parties, generally understood to mean far-right parties, to rise up for some kind of resistance, to rise up against the elected governments that are the US's allies. I was putting this to Mathew Whitaker, who's the US's ambassador to NATO, and saying, is this compatible with NATO, that you're actually asking other countries, your allies, resistance within those countries to rise up against their governments?
Absolutely. And I think the one comment that I've heard consistently across everybody I've spoken to, and as you know, everybody is speaking about this, is, on the one hand, the Trump's national security strategy is emphasizing sovereignty for everyone except Europe. And this is where the United States allows itself a real exceptionalism to dip right into its closest allies and really tell them, as you said, to rise up, really emphasizing basically the far right, and using the lens of freedom of speech in order to give legitimacy to what many Europeans consider to be very threatening to the values that they've held on to since the post-war, and since the end of the Second World War.
And it's very striking how this phrase about freedom of speech and how it's under threat in Europe is something we're hearing more and more from American officials, even as we did at Chatham House from Mike Pence, who is not in complete agreement with Donald Trump on these things. But again, that phrase comes out. I was challenging Mathew Whitaker about it, saying, look, we're seeing quite a lot of constraint of freedom of speech in the US at the moment, but still it is part of their refrain, along with the language that Whitaker used, again, like relic and museum about Europe. Let's turn to China. Yujia, you had some observations about China's appearance in this.
Interesting enough, I did a word counts before I joined this. What I've noticed is that Europe has been mentioned 45 times. However, China has been only mentioned 21 times compared with the previous version, which is China being mentioned 32 times. So actually indicate China by being actually the rivalry of the United States, and probably is one of the rivalries, not necessarily the only rival with the United States. So that sense of positioning China as being an economic competitor, but not necessarily an all-out strategic competitor. And that's somehow quite different from the previous administration, which considered China being the all-out strategic rivalry. So I think that's one difference. Now, one thing which I found very similar is if you actually joined up with China's latest 5-year plan and this national security strategy paper of the United States, you see much of similarities regarding the pursuit of self-reliance, in terms of searching for the alternative of critical minerals for both countries, and also including the upgrading on their own technologies. So I think I found some similarities actually between China and the United States. So in a way, it is not the two countries being a rivalry against each other, but it's also a mirror within itself, that when China and the United States look at each other, at how much resemblance they actually had as the national capacity developed ever since.
Would you say that the tone towards China was less aggressive than in the past? It did talk about the economic rivalry of China, but I'm very struck in the way it talked about Taiwan. Didn't mention democracy. Said we need Taiwan for chips and to preserve the sea lanes north to south in that part of the world. But it said we want to avoid a military confrontation, but we want to keep these sea lanes open. But it didn't really talk about China as a big military adversary.
I think it's not just only about military rivalry in here, but it's also equally what I've noticed, very interestingly, the Chinese Communist Party, the full name, was not even mentioned in this document as well, which is another interesting fact that this current administration of the United States no longer treating China as this debate between autocracy vis-a-vis democracy, but instead is the economic competitor. And what else? I think it seems to be quite unclear for now. So I think the key differences in here is whether China being this all competing with the United States all front, or simply and merely as only the economic competitor with the United States. So I think that's where we are.
So did you feel reading this that the US and China are less likely to go to war?
I think if I'm saying this from Beijing, the feeling is that perhaps we're now reached the bottom of the worst period of US-China relations. And when that inflection point, and perhaps the positive relationship the relationship taking a positive turn, we don't know, but it's not far away. And China naturally consider, under the current Trump administration, is perhaps the best opportunity for Beijing to increasing its national competitiveness and national capability and boosting its military capability as well.
I want to ask you, Leslie, isn't that at odds with where Congress is? Is this administration taking a different line from where many Republicans and Democrats are? Because one of the points of agreement in Congress did seem to be the regarding of China as a big threat.
Absolutely. And if you go back to the first Trump administration, it was really President Trump during the COVID pandemic who talked about China, the China virus. He's the one who really got behind, he forged, in a sense, he did forge, if you look at the data, right? And a consensus, not only within Congress, but amongst the American electorate, a very anti-China consensus. And towards the end of his first administration, Secretary of State Pompeo made this very ideological. To your point, Jerry, it became very ideological. So much more than just a sort of pragmatic and realist take on China. It was vitriolic almost. And I think President Biden's autocracy versus democracy frame, in a sense, allowed that to carry on. This really backtracks and moves it into more of a rational, realist, this is our peer competitor take, which does, potentially give more room for managing what is, obviously the most potentially destructive relationship in the world today.
And just before we swing round to the Middle East, I want to ask you about Ukraine, because Ukraine didn't get a lot of hope from this document, it seems to me. It was another place where Europe seemed squeezed. In fact, Europe portrayed as the obstacle to peace between that the US was trying to broker with Russia. How do you think the US's approach to Russia emerges from this?
Yeah, I think this document, we've seen the vacillation in President Trump's approach towards Putin, towards Russia, towards Ukraine and Europe in these past several months. But the document really takes us back to where we started, which is that Europe is again being admonished, told that it needs to, first of all, provide for its own defense, but on Ukraine, that this war needs to be resolved so that there can be strategic stability across Eurasia, which is, I think, code for saying that the US and Russia need to have a productive relationship. And that Europe kind of needs to pull it together. It is extraordinary, really, in the scheme of things, that of all the battles that this administration could choose, it's chosen Europe.
On that note, we are in the Middle East. Renard, I wanted to know what you made of this document before we talk about the debate that has been going on this weekend more generally. What does this say about the America's attitude to being involved in the Middle East?
So look, I think reading the document, some of it seems to go back to that pivoting away from the Middle East that several administrations have at least hinted at, the forever wars and why are we in the Middle East. So there's some of that. I think the problem we're seeing in it is the Middle East is more violent than it has been for a long time, and the stakes are very high. Conflicts have doubled over the last decade. And all of these wars and all of this violence that we're seeing has no end in sight. And the traditional paradigm has been that the U.S. is the arbiter of this, and the U.S. has come in the past and managed these conflicts. So the questions that many in the region are asking is there a different approach? Should regional countries be the ones managing conflicts all the way from Iran to Israel, Palestine, to the Red Sea, to Sudan? This is the region we're talking about. It's the hottest region, but it's also the fault line of this changing global order. We're in the fault line. This is whatever new order comes, the Middle East will be the first kind of sense of how that change is happening. So a U.S. that is pivoting at this moment is seen as very difficult for the region.
The document does use the words "thankfully over" for the US's need to be involved so deeply in the Middle East, saying, well, we don't need the energy anymore, we can get our own, so we can be free of it. But on the other hand, Donald Trump has put a lot of weight on the progress he asserts he's made in getting a peace plan for Gaza. And I've heard that praised a lot, including by Europeans here, or at least saying it's the only game in town, and we need to try and make it work. What is the status of that plan for Gaza?
So, of course, there's been a lot of support for the ceasefire. Everyone wanted the war to end. People wanted a ceasefire. And so no matter what, that was a necessary step that's been taken. But now there's a 20-point plan. And most people do not think that this plan will be fulfilled. Most people see that ceasefires don't last as long as they used to. They're incredibly fragile. Proclaiming mission accomplished, as we've seen in the past, does not mean that that mission is accomplished. So it may seem now, from the outside, that there is a move towards peace. But if you look at the region, there are still wars in Israel, in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iran, in Yemen, and I can go on the list in this region. So this is not a Middle East that's heading towards stability. This is a Middle East that's undergoing an incredible transformation, and at the same time, this transformation is happening as the US is looking inward and looking at its own hemisphere, as we see from this document. And so these two things lead us to conclude that we probably will expect much more conflict and violence before any sort of big peace settlement could be announced that's sustainable.
Trump's peace plan relies on countries being willing to put some kind of peacekeeping force in. And we've heard a certain amount of keenness from Indonesia, Pakistan, maybe Turkey, not from the countries in the region. Why is that?
And this is the big issue and the big question. Many of the countries in the region have, of course, been supporting the Palestinian cause and politically, but not willing yet to invest as much as needed to reconstruct or to support in terms of sending a force to Gaza. And this is the fundamental problem. They're still stuck in the old paradigm, where it is the West, where it's the US that, comes in and runs these programs. There is no thinking about something new. There is no paradigm shift being understood. There's no understanding that a regional security architecture should be developed. It's not really, rhetorically it's being said and we're hearing about it, but at the forum, here in Doha, we had a Chatham House roundtable precisely on this issue. What happens in Gaza? And the astounding sort of answer to that question was, it's not going to come from the region. There's no willingness.
There were quite a few roundtables on Gaza, and I have to say I heard a bit more optimism than that something might work because this is the only chance, if you like. But let me ask you about two other critical components. One is Syria, and the new president of Syria, and as I said, the former president of Syria fell almost exactly a year ago that we're recording. The new president of Syria, al-Shara, was on the stage here talking about and quizzed about whether he could unite Syria. And for many countries in the region, if there is going to be hope, a way out of these endless wars, it lies, and Syria stands for, this kind of remaking of the region. Do you think hope is ridiculous?
I think hope is important and necessary. And we were all here last year, and the Syrians who were here and everyone from the region was so thrilled and delighted with the change, the end of a over multiple decade dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad. And we need to keep that hope. That hope is an important energy to fuel development. But what we see in Syria today are profound challenges. Syria, from one side, Syria still has huge questions around the ethno-sectarian makeup of the country. What we've seen in terms of the relationship with the Kurds in one part, relationship with the Druze and violence in Sueda, relationships with the Alawis, and we can go on and on. At the same time, the US president and his advisors or, his envoys are saying that Syria needs to be centralized. Syria, they're not pushing this democracy anymore. Syria needs to be a state that could stabilize. So Ahmed al-Shara has made, and I think many people applaud his foreign policy. His messaging has surprised many. But at the same time, Syria is a very difficult country to govern historically. And the fact that, in a year or in 5 years, that could be turned around, I think most people would find challenging.
Absolutely. And there are a lot of nerves from those who wanted to work out about whether he can unite the country and whether the Islamists, and he was part of them, are going to tug him in that kind of direction. When asked, were you a terrorist? He argued with the definition of terrorist, but said, look, I fought for 20 years, who added, I never killed a civilian. We could have a long debate on just that. But what about Iran? Iranians here as well. Some of them saying from the stage, looking around, we can't pick our neighbors, and other countries said the same back to them. There is an uneasy relationship there, isn't there, between Iran and its neighbors, perhaps made easier because Israel and the US between them have set back Iran's nuclear program.
I think that's right. Iran is in survival mode. It's been incredibly set back in the last 2 years by Israel. But Iran, again, is looking at this in the long term, and it's already beginning to readapt. And part of its adaptation to a revisionist Israeli foreign policy in the region is not just to have good relations with Shia powers or the axis of resistance, which has been diminished, but also with neighbors, including the Gulf. Iran now has improved relations with Qatar, with the UAE, with Saudi Arabia, but also with China and Russia. And so Iran, yes, continues sanctioned by the US, yes, is still at war with Israel. But at the same time, Iran is kind of now understands that this is a long and very difficult fight. It's the Iraq-Iran war mentality that's creeping back into the Iranian leadership. So it's about survival and it's about adaptation and the kind of realization that Israel has proven that it is by far the military power in the Middle East, but that's not what makes you a hegemon. Hegemony requires much more than just military power, and that's what Iran is betting on.
So let's all just take a step back. And I'd love to hear your views about what it is we're seeing at this conference. I'm picking up Renard's phrase about this being one of the fault lines of the world, or if you like, one of the testing grounds of whether we're seeing a big change in the world order. And these conferences are full of drama and a kind of comedy. You see in 1 minute the president of Syria, al-Sharaa, you see Hillary Clinton, you see Tucker Carlson, you see lots of other people rushing around in corridors. Leslie?
From my vantage point, it feels like there is a slight ambition, but it's really tempered by exhaustion with wars that have been going on. They're not new wars in Gaza even, but obviously Ukraine, Sudan, all have been mentioned, gotten considerable attention. And now, a deep awareness that the US, in some cases for better, certainly in certain, there's been a lot of discussion of, the fact that the US might lift sanctions on Syria, that the US is doing certain good things to push forward a ceasefire to try and get a peace between Israel and Hamas. But more generally a sense that the US is really kind of either absent or disruptive or not there. And so I think people are exhausted trying to stay the course. And there's less singularity.
By people, you mean who?
The audience here, the participants. And there's less singularity. I think 2 years ago, or even a year ago, there was more sort of solidarity for the Palestinians was like driving almost the entire audience, it felt at times. But I don't sense that right now. I sense just that people are looking for leadership and they're not really finding it. They want us now they want to have hope for Syria. Not sure they can get it, but across the number of conflicts, it really does feel like the long, hard struggle. Hillary Clinton once said one thing that I thought was spot on. She said, diplomacy isn't just about the immediate wins. It's about the really boring, hard work of doing the implementation when it comes to peace agreements. And she's just not seeing that effort or even that capacity, if you're talking about the US, a slimmed down administration. But I think, more generally, that's true. We're in the long slug, and it just does feel like it's going to continue to go on. And you can feel that sort of energy in this conference.
Yujia, there haven't been a lot of Chinese speakers here, but the feeling of China's presence is very strong, I think. It has a big presence in the region.
I noticed colleagues in here use the word of hegemon and absence. I think that would equally apply to China. Is policy towards the Middle East, and also the fact that there's a glaring absence of the Chinese policymakers present in this 2 days forum. And that is already indicate how limited China would like to get involved in this region as a security provider or as a security actor by itself. And ironically, this is the only region that China and United States does not have any fundamental conflicts. And partially it's because China has been extremely happy about the United States doing all the heavy lifting regarding the Middle East and regarding the peace process and regarding mediating the conflicts, and Beijing would be comfortably by playing a commercial player and design its own economic statecraft and try to propagate its influence. However, I think the changes might come in a time that when China tried to establish itself as being a huge AI power, China wants to become the rule maker of the AI in this policy arena. And Middle East is one of the main players, and particularly for places like Abu Dhabi, with all the capitals and concentrated in those areas. And then this would actually set in China and the United States in a direct competition in terms of influence, in terms of who to make rules. But really judging from what China is trying to do, and China is really learning this from the United States by being what not to do, by being a great power, and what the United States actually failed to do. Partially is because the United States got involved in the Middle East on certain aspects that is only partially understand what has happened with the conflict itself. And China's role is largely remain within its own territory, with its own neighborhood. That is perhaps the security focus that Beijing has been given. So I've spoke to one of the Chinese participants, and the person's view was that we believe Asia Pacific was really the center of the redesigned international order, not the Middle East. So I think that mood very much reflecting on China's worldview.
I think from the perspective of the Middle East, what I'm feeling, with the chatter, underlining that chatter in this conference, in this forum, is an incredible anxiety. The region is anxious because of the reasons that we've seen, both from China and the US, and these sort of bigger powers are not looking at the region as much, but at the same time, there's violence everywhere and there's instability everywhere. The Gulf countries, for example, see both Iran and Israel, the two huge countries, powers in this region, going to war with each other. So they're looking for solutions, but they're not reaching big solutions, big ideas. And their hope in these type of forum is for those big ideas to come out. For these ceasefires that have been announced and celebrated to actually come to fruition. And I think without that end in sight, this anxiety, I think, has underlined a lot of what the conversations that have been had at this forum.
For all these unanswerable questions, unfinished questions, there is really a sense at the moment that we're watching the US stepping back from some of the areas in which it has had greatest influence, its soft power, its aid, its decision to take an active role in some parts of the world. And we have the question of whether that leaves a vacuum for China to move in, or whether, as one Middle Eastern leader said to me, wars are going to start, more wars will start, and no one comes in to stop them. And whether what we have is a vision of more wars, more conflict, less order. And we don't know the answer to that, but some of the conversations we have been discussing, and indeed the statements in the US's national security strategy as it comes up to celebrate its 250th anniversary next year, all of that makes that question very live about whether we are, in Renard's term, watching from one of the fault lines of the world these big, big shifts of power. That's the end of this special edition of Independent Thinking from the Doha Forum. See you next week.